welcome everybody. I'm so glad to have you here as we just do a Harbor vlog, video log, and our intention and my hope with this video log is simply to create a space where you can eavesdrop on a conversation with me and church planners as well as practitioners who are passionate about Christ's multicultural bride. And today I have a special guest with me, Dan Hyun, who is here to talk about his experience in planting a multicultural church. Dan is someone I think very highly of, a person that I have personally been blessed by, raised in the greater Philadelphia area. He has a degree from Penn State University, as well as a Master of Divinity and Doctorate of Ministry in Urban Missiology from Biblical Theological Seminary. He is also a pastor and has been a church planner since 2008. His church is in the Baltimore area. He also works with the Sin Network as the city missionary for Baltimore, writes for Lifeway Pastors, and has launched the Ethnos Conference, which has been going on for quite some time. So we have an opportunity here just to chop it up, talk about life, talk about the church, and to help us to continue to grow as a network. So Dad, welcome. I'm pretty sure I might have butchered your last name, as one of my spiritual gifts is not pronouncing names. So, hey man, just as you just start a conversation, how are you? Tell us a little bit about your family and how long you've been pastoring, as well as if you want to correct how I said your name. So,
wow. Well, it's an honor to be with you, Pastor. I love you and just to spend some time with you. You got the name pretty good. It's Dan Hyun, but that's hard to say. So I give grace in the midst of that. But we're doing well. Married to Judy. Our daughters are Deborah and Tabitha. And it's been a hard year like it has been for many of us. Some of you know, and you've been incredibly supportive through this journey with leukemia, both for my daughter as well as my younger brother. But just seeing, in the midst of all the challenges, God's sustaining grace and lessons probably learned that would not have been learned otherwise. So seeing God's hand through all of that.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about Tabby and Joe and how we could specifically be praying for them as they continue their journey.
Yeah, well, my daughter Tabitha, she was diagnosed with leukemia last April, so coming up on almost exactly a year. And it's been a year of challenges, but also thankfulness that she seems to be responding to treatments as well as we could hope. So it's just a long path, but we're continually dependent upon God's healing work, along with some wonderful folks who are treating her. But she's doing well. And my younger brother, who had leukemia, he actually had his stem cell transplant last summer, and seems to be responding well. And it's just a year of challenges, but really God's provision in the midst of that.
Yeah. And I know on top of that and those challenges, Judy works with the State Department. And so she's kind of been on the front lines and helping us as your state as well as our country to move forward in health amid COVID-19. So how's she doing, and how's your household right now overall?
It's a lot. Judy's working with our state health department to help with COVID tracking and response. And it's work that you can press hard and think you're doing it for about a month or two, just like when we closed down all of our churches, we're thinking, we can do this for about 2 months. And then next thing you know, it's a year. I think, and the same with her work, it's been pretty continual since last February. Yeah. So it's a lot on top of having a daughter with leukemia, but it's broken, but in the midst of that, God's pressing our family together. So struggles are there, but at the same time, we're learning, I think, even deeper love than hopefully that we might not have experienced otherwise.
Yeah. Well, we'll continue to pray for you all. I know it's hard for you and for your family, but I've just been encouraged by the way that the Lord has kept you, by your honesty, and man, we're rooting for you, and Harbor's here for you 110%. So one of the reasons that I wanted you to be our first guest is that you're familiar with Harbor Network. You've planted a multicultural church. I was on your website yesterday and just marveling at the diversity of your staff, with both leaders and people on staff who are um, Asian, Black, white, and you're in a city like all major cities, right? That um, just needs Christ's love in Baltimore. And so, thanks for being our first guest. And we're just going to riff for a little bit, and people can kind of eavesdrop on this conversation. Um, so, I would love to hear from you just about first your burden to plant a church. I believe it was planted in 2008. Um, and what is some lessons that you've learned in planting this church? Because I know your mission statement is that you all exist to lead people to reconciliation with God and reconciliation with one another. So tell me a little bit about that story and how it came about.
Yeah, a lot of it's tied to some of my own personal journey where, part of my story of how I experienced God really powerfully was I was on a reckless path, a lot of anger, even tied to today's cultural stories of racism. I think for me, that's not a new thing. So experienced that, but I responded to a wholly different way. So a lot of anger, violence. Someone said something, even looked at me funny, just getting taken care of it there on the street. Equal opportunity. I didn't like white people, I didn't like Black people, I didn't even like other Asian people. So it's just a lot of hate and rage. Yeah. But in the midst of that, God's mercy in allowing me to get in some trouble after one altercation and got arrested, thrown out of school, had to go work in a fry shop for a year. And what looked like probably the worst time of my life turned out to be a real merciful hand of God stopping me on a path where I was going, which was not healthy. That would have led to destruction. So long story short, it wasn't an overnight thing, but God started to get my attention. And as he gave me this call into ministry, part of that desire has been then, and this is where I know it's from God and not from an inner goodness, because I know I don't have that kind of love for others, but for those who I once used to have great enmity and genuine hatred and rage, God's transformed to a desire to want to see those who might be ethnically and culturally different than me, genuinely seeing them as family and not just a Christian, oh, hey, brother, but like I see them as if flesh and blood spiritually. So part of that was desiring to start a community, which again, now it's become much more in vogue, but back when we started, it was still a little bit more niche, a church where anyone could come and feel welcome to experience the good news of Jesus Christ, particularly as we addressed issues of reconciliation and justice as part of our mission.
Man, that's incredible. That's incredible. And as you think about that journey, what has it been like to plant a multicultural church? We've got pastors in our network who's attempting to do that. And just tell us a little bit about that journey and what's some major lessons that you've learned.
Yeah, I think part of it has been God stripping away some of my naivete. I'm like many pastors, and I've been to seminary and gotten some good training and thinking, even if I had the intent of wanting to see diverse cultures come together, more driven, and this is probably some of my theological background, just preach the gospel and it'll happen. And in some ways it kind of did, but I think through the journey also realizing, and before you get hate mail, let me be really clear. I believe in sufficiency of Christ. I don't believe we need to add, just to make it clear, we don't need to add anything onto the saving message of Jesus, but I also believe he gives us tools to greater accomplish the work. That's not saying Jesus's blood is not enough, but what are the things we can be more effective on in mission? And those are areas that I had to learn and grow in. And I know you even mentioned the Ethnos conference that we started. Now it's probably become a little bit more known as a justice conference or on reconciliation, which is definitely there. But honestly, I started as a missions conference because my mentality was, I felt like I was trained, especially the tribes I was in, trained really well to how to start a church, how to make disciples, do evangelism, start groups, all the structures, administration. I felt like I had a pretty decent grounding of that. But what I was not trained in was how to do cultural cross bridging work, ministries of reconciliation, loving the poor in our communities, ministries like that. And I kind of just picked it up on my own, just having to do it. So what came out of that was, I would love to start something that'll help to start to equip and train churches and individuals and things that I felt like I kind of had to pick up on my own through my own study. And that's where that started. But a lot of, I think a lot of learning that equipping had to be beyond just the normal biblical, theological, and missional training. And I know that catches a lot of grief from some people because it sounds like a liberal leaning. You're not trusting in the scriptures. And I mean, I love the scriptures. I'll put my biblical love up with anyone. That sounds proud to say that, but it's not that I don't believe in those things, but I believe, some of the journey has had to learn, especially as we have pastors who are thinking about how to do more multi-ethnic bridge crossing kind of ministry, the need for things like cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, areas that I think sometimes in our traditional training grounds, maybe are not even talked about as much. I think it's becoming a little bit more commonplace now, but definitely when I was going through, not as much. So I think that has been one of the biggest things, realizing the intent can be great and even the vision can be beautiful, but just like with any other desire for ministry, we've also got to put in training grounds for people to be equipped and built up to be as successful as possible in these kind of ministries.
Yeah, that's good. And for anybody who has questions about you and your love for the sufficiency of scripture, man, I might just tag your sermon from when you preached at Midtown a few years ago from Joshua chapter 1, verse 8. It was one of the more memorable sermons that's been preached here since I've been here. So thanks, brother. So as you think about this, and I mean, you've been in the game for a while now, and you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly more than we could talk about in 25 minutes. But as you think about what Christ has done to shape the Village Church in Baltimore, what would you say to specifically, Black, brown, leaders, African-American, Latino, Asian pastors who really care about Christ's multicultural bride? What would you say, looking back when you were first starting, what would you tell yourself?
Well, one thing, I mean, maybe a couple of things, but one, if it feels really hard, if it feels like really difficult, it's because it is. And all ministry is hard. This is not to negate the difficulty, challenge of any kind of ministry, especially church planting. But I believe there's a particular burden, especially for people of color, but I would say obviously Black and brown pastors who are desiring to be at the forefront of leading these kind of ministries, because you're carrying the normal burden of pastoring and church planting and pioneering, but you're also having to navigate all these words. So if it feels challenging, hard, you're not fooling yourself. There's not anything wrong with you. Part of our journey in learning even what it means to be a multicultural church is there's just got to be a continual sense of dying to yourself, because everyone loves a diverse looking church, but not everyone loves the aspects of having to die to yourself to make that happen. Even as a pastor of a church myself, there have been some things we do and I'm like, I don't know if I like that all that much. I mean, that doesn't speak to my soul, but I see how her heart's being touched by that. And he's coming in ways he wouldn't and there's a continual sense, if we're gonna reach across these different lines, it requires a certain death to ourselves, but that can be painful. Just so some of you pastors who are hurting to know, you're not making it up, you're carrying extra burdens on top of what a normal pastor would. And I would say, Pastor, one thing that's, and we've used this illustration for a while, but I think the past year has really brought it to focus, this idea to do cross-cultural ministry. It almost requires you to be a bridge. Yeah. And we keep using that word. But the idea that the reason a bridge exists is to be walked over.
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes when you're in these spaces of not being in between, I would say, but it's a different way, but you will be walked over, and it can feel like that almost literally.
Yeah.
A lot of, whether it's being walked over with actions, silence, or words, it can be really difficult. So maybe one thing I would also encourage in that is to take care of yourself. It's not selfish to say that I've got some trauma here. I've got some wounds. It's not more Christ-like to kind of, well, we're all suffering. So no, you might be bearing some particular burdens that even the everyday pastor out there might not fully understand. So find ways to take care of yourself. Part of that, and this is something I've pressed into more, I think, where I used to say, for me to be a cross-cultural pastor, I can only associate with people of other ethnicities, because I really want to press into that. I think recently in this past year, I've been pressing into actually more and more older relationships with other Korean pastors, because there's a sense, even those who are doing similar things to what we are, because there's a part you kind of understand each other. You
Yes.
get the burdens you're going through, and you don't have to take all the time trying to explain, because that can be just as tiring as anything. So
Mhm.
I know it looks almost opposite of a reconciliation message, but I would find people who do get you, and it's okay. There's nothing wrong with pressing into those things. And I guess tied to that, this might be a little controversial, but don't feel like you have to deny aspects of your wonderful cultural background to make other people feel more comfortable.
Mhm.
I think that might be the biggest mistake I think I've
Yeah.
learned, that I've had to work through, because my desire was always, and maybe that's some of the Asian cultural background as well, deny myself. And so it's that denial message. At the same time, don't deny how God has made you, because
Right.
part of the reason that you are going to be able to do some stuff that other churches might not is because of the unique wiring, how God has designed you to be, including your ethnicity and your background and all the beautiful, wonderful things you bring in.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent. Yeah, one of the things that was a major breakthrough for me was uh, uh, Corey Edwards wrote a
Mm,
piece called Estranged Pioneers.
mm,
And it happened about maybe 2.5 years ago. And it was just in the middle of me learning a lot of different things as our church was becoming multicultural. And basically, what she does is, if you're familiar with her work, she does a qualitative study and looking at specifically African American pastors and Asian American pastors who pastor in majority white spaces. And what she came out of that study saying is that when you do this massive qualitative study, is that their experience is equivalent to that of third culture kids who start off in America, move when they're young, live in another culture, and try to come back into it, how they're really not understood. And so she dubbed those pastors who are doing that work as estranged pioneers, right? And so, man, that illustration that you just used as a bridge is just profound. It just reminded me of her work. So, if those of you who are listening, I think everyone who cares about the multicultural church would benefit from finding that study and reading it. Well, Pastor, I'm gonna, man, just keep it 100 with you. Be real. Um, one of the things that I am struggling with and have been processing and reading a lot is just the pain that's caused right now by uh, looking at the anti Asian racism that's happening in our country. And my heart grieves, it breaks. And um, one of the more troubling things for me is seeing um, African Americans harm uh, those who are created in the image of God, Asian Americans, right? And it's actually pretty awkward because most of my existence in life, I've just seen African American, as a Black African American man, like us on the other side of racism. And so I've been having a hard time processing, reading that. I'm just curious, you know, from your perspective, like, yeah, just I would love for you to share with me just that tension, which I've always known growing up in Chicago. You always know there's a tension there, but just it being lived out right now. How has that impacted you? And two, how has that impacted your church? Because you all have that dynamic there.
Well, I would, I guess first just appreciate and thank you, Doc, because I think one of the things many Asian Americans have been feeling right now, even maybe even more in Christian spaces, is that idea of being invisible.
Yeah.
And you kind of always told, no, we're all family, you're all part of this. But then as many Asian Americans have been going through a trauma that I think it's hard for an individualistic society to understand, why are you sad? This didn't
Yeah.
happen yet. You're just, when you're a person of color, a minority within the larger space, you just have a collectivist sense, and just some of our Eastern background, you just experience things in a collective sense. And I think a lot
Absolutely.
of my Black and brown brothers understand that, brothers and sisters
Mhm.
understand that sense. So I think just the fact that you reach out, like I can't let you convey how much my heart was touched when you even sent me that message
Yeah.
originally.
Yeah.
Because I was at a point where I'm like, forget y'all.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you just get tired of kind of being the invisible and kind of just assimilated in. But I think
Yeah.
what you're talking about is some real, and it's to be frank, some of the greatest advocates that we've seen in the Asian American community have been Black and brown brothers and sisters.
Yeah. Yeah.
There, I mean, that's just a reality.
Yeah.
because I think there's a shared solidarity and understanding what it means to experience trauma and injustice and to be
Yeah.
kind of overlooked or to have your racism kind of minimized or almost kind of gaslit in those things and start to doubt yourself. So I think there's been a sense of solidarity. Part of that has been a wonderful sense also of digging into some of the very things you mentioned about. And, this is the biggest pushback I think we were getting with some of these instances of Asian hate, where people say, well, this isn't race. Why y'all blaming whitey? It's a black dude that's knocking out these. Why are you blaming white people? What's this?
Yeah.
Why is everyone blaming white? And I think it's recognizing some of the deeper systemic issues that have caused some of that rift between Black and Asian peoples. And even when I say that, obviously no one's a monolith, but
absolutely.
just in larger terms, where I know some of the larger media narratives can even put just a giant wedge between the community saying, well, look at Asians. They're the model minorities. They come to this country with nothing. They just put their head down. They don't complain. They're not asking for a handout. They just work, and look at them. They're successful. Why can't you be like them? But then I think for a lot of Asians, recognizing that myth of the model minority, and this has been part of even eye-opening journey for me, not just this year, but if it's kind of brought to,
absolutely,
in some sense, you can succeed as much as they tell you to. You can hit the top and there's still that glass ceiling, but you can hit as high as you go, but there's a certain sense you will never fully be part. And that sounds really dark.
Yeah.
But I think there's some reality to that. And especially as Asian Americans, I think many are experiencing that. So I think it's pressing into some of those issues of pain, but recognizing even some of the division, you just don't hear about because of the media narratives, like even during the civil rights movement, because a lot of this, and it's not always from Christians, but some African community, community and African Americans are saying, well, why should we care about Asian Americans' issues? They don't care about us.
Yeah.
If anything, they're the people who've looked at us as less than human. The worst racists I know are like the Korean store owner or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think for Asian Americans, this has also been a reckoning to say, hey, y'all can't just stand up for your own injustice. But if you're going to stand up for injustice, you got to recognize this is not just about you when you're hurting, but a Christ-like stand for justice is standing for all peoples, and you need to actually raise your voice, be more active. You need to advocate and work not just for Asians who are hurting, but other communities, immigrants, African Americans, different orientations. As controversial as it might, you need to be Christ to other peoples. It's not just caring for yourself. So hopefully, we're actually even having a lot of conversations intentionally between Black and Asian leaders, talking about the things we have in common and also giving space, because I think relationship guides talking about hard things and digging into it and saying, hey, this is real, but don't be so moved by what larger media narratives are saying should divide us.
That's good, man. That's a fantastic explanation, man. And so so these are conversations that you're having even within your church right now, I'm sure.
Within the church, but also it's really part of my work is working beyond our church in our city, and just with some of my closest friends are pastors of other churches, and just a broad swath of different ethnic backgrounds, and just talking about these things. And part of it is, I think, a hopeful idea. Relationship is allowed to have some conversations that are not always as beneficial on platforms, say social media.
Absolutely.
It can be very truthful, but I think you need a girding of relationship to be able to enter certain conversations.
Yeah, you do. And understanding that there's grace there, we're all learning. And the only way we're going to actually address these issues is if we get honest and get real and bring our true self and our vulnerable self to say, like, man, I don't understand it all and I need help with this, or this is my experience growing up, because there's, like I said, there's always been that tension. When I look back on being in Chicago, I didn't quite understand it. As I got older, I'm like, okay, I can understand it a little more as you're just in majority Black spaces. And, you have stores that's owned and operated by Asian Americans. And sometimes there's this tension there because of what they've experienced by African Americans who come in. And sometimes there's like, hey, you're here, how are you contributing other than so, but it's been a learning process, and I'm thankful for friends like you who I could chop it up with and could continue to teach and learn from each other in this. So, man, as we close, uh, and as you think about the church planting movement and all that's happening, this reckoning, racial reckoning that continues to happen here in America, what would you say? We've kind of talked to Black uh, and brown leaders and leaders of all stripes and encouraged them. What would you say to white allies and pastors who want to do this deep work? I've told some that I've met, like, don't plant a multicultural church because I mean, seriously, I've done that at conferences and really upset people. Like, man, you're not ready. Like, you just don't do it. Like, just don't do it. Well, we want to plan this area. Well, support another planner or make yourself the number 3 or 4, right? But what about people who want to be allies to grow and they want to be a part of this beautiful mosaic?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think one of the challenges, and just in our context, we're talking about a lot of people of color who are probably trying to lead within majority white spaces. And there's just particular challenge with that. I think part of that is feeling that you're not seen.
Yeah.
I mean, just to be real, even with the kind of national trauma we're experiencing right now with another officer shooting of a Black man.
Yep.
I think there becomes a wearying effect where you just feel like people don't care, even if that might not be the truth. But I think one of the greatest things that white allies can do is just to remind those who are not white, hey, I see you, I care for you. It doesn't always have to be done on social media, which I think
it does. Yeah.
Sometimes if you have a relationship with someone, just letting them know and not just assuming that you care about them. Just like if someone in our church were hurting, we're not just going to assume they know it. You're going to reach out to them. And I would wholly agree with what you were saying. I'm glad you said it, so I don't have to be the one get in trouble and get the hate email. But in terms of, I know there's a big move towards wanting to plant multi-ethnic churches, which is admirable. I mean, who wants to plant a KKK church? It's
right.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. But I mean, even for our small family of churches, we planted one church a couple of years ago, and our hope is to do more of that out of the village. But part of that is to be planting churches that are obviously rooted in the gospel and mission, but part of that is very fluent in conversations of justice and reconciliation and starting that from the DNA. But for us, part of that means we want to see minority-led multi-ethnic churches.
That's it.
Because I do think we need, I know multi-ethnic church has taken a beating. Some people saying it's just oppressive, it's not helpful. But I think there's always gonna be challenges we gotta navigate through. But I think having leadership that are fluent in some of those ways that don't even have to necessarily be trained, but you learn to be emotionally intelligent, culturally intelligent, just because that's life.
Yeah.
And your third culture without anyone using that kind of language.
Absolutely.
And I think churches that can be led by that, and that doesn't just have to be the lead church planter, but I think I'm a big advocate for that.
Yeah.
I believe that is something I want to get behind and see more of. And for white allies, if we're really serious about this, not having to be the one that drives the conversation or the movement or the mission, but willing to submit to other leadership, using the influence that you do have. So I want to be really clear. I don't believe that people who are minorities need more help. Sometimes that's the mentality, well, they just need more of our help. I don't think that's the case, but it's recognizing some of the systemic factors that have made it not as easy to get moving in even a church planting, things that maybe majority culture pastors just take for granted. Well, yeah, everyone's got to work hard, but everyone can do it. Well, you don't recognize all the different aspects involved. But if you do have some of that, leverage and capital, utilizing that to benefit others. So when we talk about the whole dying to yourself, maybe as pastors, part of dying to ourselves is recognizing I don't just exist to make my name great or my movement great. How am I going to use what I have to invest in someone else and just walk with them because they've got it. They've got the ability. They've got the gifting. It's not that they need my help, but what can I walk and provide them with that can help them to do what they probably have the ability to do through God's spirit and power.
That's right. No, that's great. Yeah, we don't want for white pastors, right? And what we're saying is for you all to just go out and start a multicultural church if you're not living a multicultural life or able to see this nation's strongholds, you're going to do more damage and cause more pain than necessary, right? and helping them to see that oftentimes when white culture comes against other culture, because of the history of this country and the systemic issues and the history of white supremacy, right? That culture is going to win, as one author said. And so this call to humility, to serving, and to seeking to be a learner before you plant, right? And create a space where every culture can feel like home, and is gospel saturated is the goal. But yeah, brother. Well, thank you so much for your time. Uh, Thank you for your faithfulness to Jesus and his church, for your faithfulness to your family, um, and to your city, man. One of the things I admire about you is you're Baltimore through and through. And so any way that Harbor can continue to love and support y'all just let us know. And proud to be a co-laborer with you, brother.
Well, thank you. And I do want to thank so many good friends from Harbor Network who have definitely been there with us through the past year in different ways. And we're really grateful for you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Grateful for you, man. Tell Judy we said hi.
I will.